This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Good morning and welcome to the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast. I'm Brian Shrader, agronomist on the east side of the state of Indiana, joined as always by my co-host Ben Jacob from southern Indiana. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning, Brian. How are you?
Very good. So, Ben, there are a lot of topics that we could cover as we sit here on the 18th day of March. We could talk about planter maintenance. We could talk about temperature to plant seed. We could talk about just all sorts of things. But certainly one of the things that gets everybody excited and is something that's going on right now for most of our customers is watching the weather. And, a lot of research has been done over the years, and you can look at a number of spreads, I guess you will, on how much weather impacts the yield of a particular crop. We know we certainly can't control it, but I don't think that keeps us from watching it and wondering what's going to happen. And so our guest today is Tim Hart. Tim is part of the research group. He's a senior research associate. And Tim was recommended the podcast when I reached out to Agronomy Sciences a few weeks ago and asked about who would be the pioneer weather expert, was how I phrased that. And our good friend Ken O'Brien recommended that we talk with Tim. So welcome to the podcast, Tim. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me this morning. I guess I'll start out with a little bit of background. I've been with the company about 14 years now. Started out in supporting some of our crop growth models. Obviously, for the crop growth models, weather's a big input. My background is in meteorology, environmental management also, and I've always worked a lot with instrumentation over the years. From that crop growth model beginning, I've gotten more and more involved in the weather pillar. When the weather pillar was first started, I want to say it was 2017. I was the product owner on that for the first couple of years. Part of that was identifying sources to put in and working with the data engineering teams on how they were going to stand up the weather pillar, what variables would be available, that kind of stuff. I will say that the weather pillar was initially started to support crop growth models, so we would have daily time steps. It's been the last couple of years where we've started integrating a lot more of our sub-daily, is what we've been calling it, hourly data. A lot of the data stations that Corteva has in their within the company are 15-minute or hourly, so we can expose that data nowadays in the weather pillar and in the APIs.
So talk to us a little bit about what the weather pillar actually is. You mentioned that it was stood up to help with crop growth models, and we can talk a little bit about crop growth models today. We've had Leighton Pennycord and some others on the podcast previously that I know use a lot of this data, but talk to us a little bit about, when we hear you say weather pillar, what exactly is the weather pillar?
Okay, so the weather pillar, in my mind, it is the source of all weather data within the organization. It's worldwide. We have stations on all 7 continents. Density of stations is big. There's different station densities depending on where you are in the world. Obviously, Latin America doesn't have the same density as North America. I believe there's something like 32 different sources that funnel into the weather pillar. NOAA sources or airport reporting, all of our internal Corteva weather station networks, and then different regions of the world, we have different publicly available sources. We do purchase a few sources around the world kind of to fit in. We've been doing that in Brazil, Chile, and part of Europe on the GSO side of things. They just need some trying to improve that density coverage. So obviously we'd have to purchase sometimes. We can't place weather stations everywhere we would need them. It's just economically not possible for the organization.
Sure. So Talk to us a little bit, Tim, about what makes a good weather source. I mean, there's lots of services out there that, you can put your own, one that is common, in North America would be Weather Underground. You look through some of those types of sources. Some of those weather stations are not necessarily very accurate when you look at them kind of spatially within their neighborhood. Obviously, quality of data is utmost important when you're looking at weather forecasting, and certainly we'll get into this in a few minutes around interpolation. But talk to us a little bit about how do we as Corteva decide that a source is high quality and should be incorporated into the weather pillar?
So obviously we go for a lot of government type sources that are controlled by the government funding. Different regions of the world, countries are supporting their own weather station networks. We do pull in a lot of the Weather Underground, we call them PWS stations, personal weather stations.
Yeah.
Part of the ingest, so that each of these sources, the weather pillar ingests on a daily basis. So we would, at roughly 3 a.m., we have yesterday's weather for these sources. When they ingest that data, they are doing some of that, as you mentioned, that nearest neighbor comparison, flagging data. They will not expose, if the nearest 10 stations are all saying it's 70 degrees out and one station says it's 40, they don't bring that into the weather pillar, and they definitely don't turn that around into the interpolation. And so they're looking at nearest neighbors, sensor drift, that kind of thing. Part of the weather initiative that I'm involved in is we are trying to expose this. We are future looking. If the weather pillar data engineering team can identify that a sensor's bad and it's on one of our Corteva stations, then we will reach out to that station owner and say, hey, we think you need a new wind speed sensor, or our current thought is we would like to have some spare sensors, and we could ship a sensor, it can get replaced, the old one could come back, and we can calibrate or repair that and put it into the pool to go out for the next one. That's kind of where we're hoping to get moving forward. We're also trying to identify locations where you're 30, 40 kilometers from the nearest station. And if it's a research field, then maybe we want to identify that and spend the funds to put an actual weather station there.
Okay. Since I guess since we talked about the quality of the data, and we have mentioned the interpolation a little bit, talk to us a little bit, I guess, about what all within the organization we are using this for. Ben and I see growers who, is it going to rain? How much did it rain? Those kind of things. We've talked about the the crop growth model, but where are we using weather within the organization, and how are we using it?
So obviously Granular Insights is using it. Pioneer.com is using sourcing from the weather pillar, Performance Explorer, GSO. And a lot of what we're doing is calculating GDUs to crop growth stages or something. So we're using the weather data to predict when a planted field might reach V6, V7. And then on the research side, we've just started up a new project where we're starting to programmatically calculate GDUs. So if somebody says a field flowered on July 5th, we take note of that date, and then the system will calculate GDUs up to there. Currently, and in the past, we have no way of knowing where the weather input for those GDUs came from. Each research location or each person might go to Weather Underground. They might go to WeatherLink and use the Davis thing. They could go to the nearest airport. At least if we can automate this, we know that the source is identical for all of these locations, and we can then go ahead and back calculate too if we need to, because we know where the data is coming from.
Okay. We've talked about this a little bit, or at least mentioned it. Most wide area weather data that's pulling in all of these different sources use some type of interpolation. I know that that's certainly part of our weather pillar. Can you explain to our listeners what interpolation is, and then talk to us a little bit about how we do that, or how we approach that from a Corteva perspective?
Yep. So when you make a call to the weather pillar, an API call, you would pass in a lat log that you're interested in and a date range. The weather pillar then goes out and looks for the 6 nearest weather stations to that requested point. We then average the data from those 6 stations to provide data for your range. Now, with that being said, there is some weighting on the distance. So if one station, if you have a weather station that's 1 kilometer from your lat log, obviously that one weights more than one that's 10 kilometers away. So we also account for that within the weather pillar interpolation.
Okay. Ben, from your perspective, how I'm going to tap into your research time, working with Jason and others. How would you use this weather data, in real life? Help our listeners understand how someone who's in the field and needs this information, how are you using it?
Yeah, so I think Tim kind of glossed over a very good point there, and that is the consistency across an area. So, I think for an individual grower, it's your whatever app that you're using to look at your weather, and it defaults to your farm, and you're trying to understand, if you're managing very intensely, and sometimes some folks are starting to recommend some management considerations on corn around heat accumulation. Right, some of the high yield groups are doing that, and so if we look at doing management more intensely and using another input to help make some of those decisions, having something like this that is at least consistent across the areas, has value there. And I think if we go back to 2017 when this was getting started, and the crop modeling efforts that Tim mentioned that it supported, I was one of the field teams for those crop modeling efforts, and arguing with this technology. And I would say that from my perspective, everything that we were doing then was brand new, just from the sheer number of data points compared to conventional plant breeding and everything. So I'm gonna interpolate a little on my own based on what I was doing early on, that the amount of data this is pulling in, and the ability to process that and make sense of it to give a deliverable on the backside is probably one of the bigger wins for all of this. And then the number of places that gets used, I think that even if we're not using it directly to make those management decisions, everything else that the weather pillar gets fed into, like the fungicide timing model. And I'm sure that, as folks start to hear about water reporter, I know that it's geared for irrigation, but I'm sure that there are some practical applications. I know Paul Yoder across the river from me this will be his second year working with that, and he's found a great deal of value in that as a management aid. So I think the consistency again is key, to really having a useful tool, knowing that it's doing the same thing in this field that's 20 miles north of me as it is at the home farm. If we're going to be able to make decisions out of that. But I wouldn't discount some of the tools that are coming through insights and the value that this is providing through them.
Yep. Now, I guess one thing, Tim, a lot of our growers, as Ben mentioned, have got some kind of app on their phone, whatever it may be. You've got some access as a Pioneer customer, or actually a grower in general, through insights, granular insights. But, Pioneer really doesn't have this full blown weather app. That's not necessarily maybe our space necessarily, but I know that you've looked at and talked about what growers look for in an app and some of the challenges to try to create that. Can you talk to us about, I guess, maybe the difference in the weather pillar and what it's pulling versus what maybe an individual would have in an app, and why Pioneer doesn't necessarily have its own proprietary weather app because of some of those challenges?
I would say probably the biggest issue that we see is the communication of where the data comes from. So we use the weather pillar data in the background for insights, for fungicide timing, all that kind of stuff. But I think as an organization, we've kind of consciously made that decision that we do not want to have a weather app per se. One of the biggest issues in whether it's Water Report or Pioneer.com, whatever tool you're using is, I got 1 inch of rain on my farm last night. You're telling me I got 1.5, or you're telling me I got 1/4 of an inch. That's a huge issue, communicating that to people. And I think if you did have that app, it's going to, more of those questions are going to arise, especially with the way that we're interpolating data and averaging. Part of the theory behind that when we stood up the weather pillar was to try to account for some of that difference in precipitation over spatial differences in precipitation. If a storm passed 10 miles north and got 1 inch of rain, well, by interpolating, you should see 1/4 inch at your location. Now, that's not necessarily always true. The other thing I would add to that is, and Brian, I think you kind of alluded to it earlier, is your maintenance of stations. Many times people are like, well, my station isn't recording something, or it's too high, too low. And it's, hey, have you cleaned your tipping bucket out? Have you, is your temperature sensor in the shade half the day? That type of thing. It's citing, and we've actually stood up an internal SharePoint site where we've started to talk about how to properly cite a weather station. Obviously, it's pretty important for us to get those stations in the agronomic area versus, I mean, we've done studies in the past, and we know that the airports with their weather stations on tarmacs report higher temperatures than what you're going to see out in the ag field. Personally, I think our network of Davis stations, which we have 500-600 of them within the weather pillar feeding into it, is a great source because they are typically all at fields or near fields and not at airports. And that day, so we get much lower nighttime temperatures. And we know that with certain sources, we're biased depending on where those sites are at.
Yeah, you mentioned the airport sites. One of the sites that at times can be a little bit comical for me as well is that a lot of wastewater plants have weather stations as well. And sometimes if you drive by and you see where some of those weather stations are specifically, it's no wonder that we occasionally get some really random numbers from some of those wastewater stations. I see that on a pretty regular basis. So, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I would add to that, and you guys have both probably seen it also. When you drive by somebody's homestead and there's a weather station on a fence row and it's leaning at 45 degrees, tells me right there they're not taking care of it, they're not maintaining it. Can we trust that data? Probably not. So a lot of it, again, is communication on, you need to do this regularly or your data is not going to be any good.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned the tipping bucket, not getting it cleaned out. Back last spring, I was having an issue, and I actually do ground truth my own station with just a regular old analog rain gauge just to make sure, to double check. And I had actually had a dead bee right at the tip. And so if you put your hand into the bucket, you couldn't feel anything. It had gotten through down to the actual tipping chamber and it had blocked that little inlet. But to look at it and even take it apart, I had to take the weather station completely apart. But had I not ground truthed that with an analog gauge, I'd have never realized that I was off. I'm in an area where the density is not as high as I would like for it. And so it was completely possible that just because of variation in rainfall, I for a while thought that my rain gauge was correct, and then I got to looking a little bit more, and just, you didn't notice it. You have to maintain those if you want accurate data. It's really like anything else, Ben. I think, if you want your yield monitor to be accurate, you have to calibrate it. You have to take care of it. You have to make sure those sensors are correct. Your weather station's no different. I'd argue maybe even a little bit more, because they're certainly not nearly as robust as the sensors for a yield monitor. A lot of these are pretty inexpensively made, so you have to be careful.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, think about the time it takes you to maintain and keep that up. And it's just like with yield monitors, if you're using it to make any sort of decision, and even if it's not part of a bigger project, if you're just trying to make decisions for your own farm, it's garbage in, garbage out. I mean, it's the same. It's the same with all data. If you have junk and you're using it to make decisions, you're going to make the wrong decisions. So, yeah, a few minutes once a month, you're good. So,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tim, you mentioned when you came to the organization, you were the project owner for the weather pillar. Talk to us about what those initial conversations were like when you got ready to stand the weather pillar up. We had always had, the ability to put your zip code in, and you could pull some things up on pioneer.com in the early days. I've been with the organization a little over 20 years now, so I've kind of seen this evolve. But when you first started with the goal or the mandate to start the weather pillar, how did you start that kind of a task? It seems almost Herculean to get done, just as we talk about it.
So I'm going to say it's not as Herculean as you might expect, because prior to the weather pillar, we were already running crop growth models. We had Performance Explorer, we had the N-class system, and those all still had weather as inputs. What the weather pillar did was we shifted from an on-premise storage to cloud storage. So we took all of our historical data from the on-prem, loaded it up into the cloud, and then we started building those APIs to expose that data back out. So it wasn't like we were starting from scratch. We had a pretty good foundation when we started. We did add more sources into the weather pillar than we had in our on-prem stuff. And regionally, we added like all of Eastern Europe, which we never really had in the on-prem. The on-prem that was, like I mentioned, mainly for the crop growth models, and it was where we were running crop growth models at, is where the on-prem was concentrated. Weather pillar, we made the conscious decision. We know we're probably going to want to run simulations worldwide at some point. So let's start now with bringing in sources from worldwide sources. We did partner up with IBM, and they have their own network. Well, I say IBM, it's actually the weather company, which is the Weather Channel. And they were using all of the same sources that we were publicly available. They have their own proprietary endpoints and grid spacing and stuff, but we are bringing some of their historical data is reanalyzed data, so it's probably similar to what we're doing, but it's on a gridded basis, and we can actually see that grid size. IBM's given us those grids, so we do know where they are and stuff. There's I don't remember, it's been so long, like 4 billion grid points over the surface of the, yeah. Now, obviously, we're not interested in most of those because they're over water. So we do limit it down a little bit.
I'm going to turn the tide just a little bit, maybe change subjects, only because maybe this is more of a personal interest for me. As you look at where we're at right now with the pillar within Corteva, but also the future of, I guess, data science, Tim, where do you see not only the weather pillar for Corteva, but overall maybe forecasting and analyzation of meteorological data going in the next 5-10 years? I mean, where are we headed in terms of not only the organization, but growers being able to use this data to make those better decisions Ben talked about?
So I have two thoughts off the top of my head on that. The first one I'm going to start with, we are already looking at climate change, and we've got part of the data science team is taking data from the historical data from the weather pillar and starting to run those simulations for a 10% increase in precipitation or X% increase in temperature, decrease, or whatever the case may be. I do think that where we're going, it kind of scares me. And I'll give you an example, is I think that AI is going to become involved more and more in weather and making decisions. You're probably, I don't want to call anybody out here. We have some sensors that are very easy to install. They're a single unit, and they, working with the company, they have a lot of AI information in their weather variables. And it kind of scares me because where are they getting this information? We have them co-located next to our Davis sites, and we see vast differences in temperatures and rainfall and stuff. And part of our working with this company is we are trying to help them with their sensors, and we are giving them data so that they can make comparisons. But they're not really completely open as to what data is measured and what data is derived.
Okay.
So, I mean, you see the weather station, and it's a tiny little unit, and yet you're getting 42 variables out of it. So,
yeah,
I mean, I can tell you they're measuring temperature. I can see the temperature, relative humidity. They've got an acoustic precipitation gauge. So it's no moving parts. Where are we going? I think we're going towards more, and I think this is a good thing, more weather stations without moving parts.
Okay.
We've been evaluating a couple others on rainfall, and rainfall is very, very difficult. Back to your tipping bucket. I mean, we know tipping buckets underestimate in heavy rain.
Yep.
Now, some of these acoustic type sensors, they might pick up light rain or fog better. I mean, you're probably not going to get a fog or a mist measurement from a tipping bucket, but really, how much does that impact a crop? Not that much, unless it's several days of mist.
Right.
So there's all kinds of issues where I do believe that moving forward, we will have, I don't know if we'll have more physical stations, but we'll have more, the grid side as computing, the cost of computing, we'll get smaller grid sizes, we'll get better data points over time. It's just, I mean, that's the way the world has gone in the last 30 years. Everything's bigger, better, faster, more.
Yeah. As a meteorologist, as a data person, you know, one of the things that I find interesting is that for a few dollars per year, you can get access to all of this weather data that you talked about. There's a number of services. If you get on the internet or on YouTube and you watch any number of the meteorologists that follow storms or whatever, they've got all these monitors. And you, as just a common everyday person, can get access to almost all this data that you talked about. From a professional standpoint, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing in talking about AI interpreting this data and all of that? Because I'm just amazed at, as a weather junkie myself, for $100 a year, I can get a high level data to look at. I don't know necessarily what I'm looking at, but I got access to it. Is that a good thing in your mind?
I definitely think it's a good thing. I, as you said, a person that's interested in data, I don't think you can, well, yeah, you can't have too much data, but with weather data, it's always changing, and having access to that, it starts your example of your bee in your funnel. Maybe because you looked at something online, it caused you in the back of your mind to start thinking something's going on with that tipping bucket. So to me, that's information that you're receiving, that you're making decisions on, consciously or subconsciously. I don't think that I do think that growers are out there. That yes, they might have a favorite app, they might have a favorite website, but I guarantee you, they're using more than one. They're they're talking amongst themselves. They all have their favorite, but they're also looking at other sources. I mean, I find new weather sites or apps all the time, and I'm investigating them. I pick what apps and websites. I pick what I like, what shows me what I want to know, what I can visually interpret fast, rather than and then there's other things where I'm poking through them regularly, just trying to understand what they're doing.
Yep. Ben, I guess a thought that I have for you, I know that you tend to look at this as well. What is your app of choice currently? And I don't know that we're endorsing anything, but as Tim notes, everybody's got kind of their favorite one. Do you have a favorite right now that you're using or that you would recommend?
I don't, Brian. I don't really have one that I found to replace Weather Underground. I used to really like Weather Underground until Apple bought them, and now it's less reliable, in my opinion. So I will say though that for severe weather in particular, or maybe some long range forecast, I use X. There's I think Indiana Weather Online, and then of course everybody's familiar with BAM Weather. That like for storms, the Indiana Weather Online does a really good job of kind of forecasting, like when when we had the tornadoes here locally just under a year ago.
Yep.
Actually, I mean they pretty well nailed the track of it.
Yeah.
There ahead of time. So I don't have, as far as a daily forecast though, I don't have one that I love. Like
Okay.
like I mentioned, Weather Underground was that until it went way downhill, and I just haven't found anything that to replace it. So I still use it. It's just not near as accurate as it used to
Okay.
be.
Tim, I'll ask you the same thing. Again, not necessarily endorsing anything, but just three folks here visiting about their weather apps. Do you have a favorite that you like or that you recommend to folks that ask you?
App wise, I really like Windy.
Mm-hmm.
It has radar, satellite, temperature data. It actually exposes several models in there, future model outputs. To me, when you're looking at a forecast, and this is what your local station's going to do, that they're looking at multiple models and combining them. They've got the local knowledge. But with that being said, I would say my go-to is NOAA. All of your local forecasting agencies, they are there because they know that region. They are going to provide the best forecast for your area versus I'll just say IBM, who's trying to forecast for the whole US. They don't have that local knowledge. Now, I think they have some of it. Obviously, that would probably be geared towards more populous areas. But I think in the ag world, you need to go to the local experts. And to me, that would be your National Weather Service.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that. I certainly NOAA is one that I recommend to everybody here in the state of Indiana, and Illinois for that matter. One of the other recommendations that I would have would be the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, the MRCC. That is a great resource, especially when you're looking for that historical climate data that you talked about. They have what I consider to be one of the best GDU monitoring tools that's out there. And so I really like that. And then along with Windy, my go-to is actually my radar. I like that, especially as you mentioned the other day, Ben, for the storms that we had here in Eastern Indiana just last week, that hit the town of Selma in my geography and Winchester. Those two tornadoes, they got that right on. Their radar tracking was excellent. And so but Windy's very good, as Tim mentioned. So as we kind of finish up the podcast here, I appreciate you peeling the curtain back for us on the weather and how we're using it. Anything else that maybe we haven't mentioned or that would be worth a discussion for our growers that listen to the podcast around weather in general, maybe thoughts that you have or ideas, or even how you think that Corteva is using weather?
So, yeah, Um, what I was going to say before, sorry, those regional climate centers, they're great. I love that. I think you're referring to the U2U
Yes. Yep.
GDU for, yeah,
Yep. You got it.
that's a very good one. But one thing that I think Corteva's underutilizing is some of our IBM products, which in our agreement with IBM Weather Channel, we can push all that information onto growers, and we have the ability to do things like soil temperature, soil moisture predictions. They're coming in. We have those IBM products, wind events. So we should be, in my mind, if we have the ability to tell a grower, we know their field and where it's been planted at, and there was a wind event last night. Well, we should be texting, emailing, or something that, hey, you might want to check this field for there's possible 70-mile-per-hour winds through there at midnight last night. Whatever. To me, I think we can be a lot more proactive as an organization and help our growers. I will add to that. I'm not sure if the organization wants to play in that space either, because there are so many other opportunities, or growers can go to so many other sources of that information. I do think that internally and even grower facing, we are, and we kind of touched on it earlier, we are lacking a tool to view weather data. To me, I envision a dashboard where if you have 50 fields, you should be able to see rainfall for each of those fields every morning when you get up. I mean, most growers are doing that anyway. They're going to different sources and trying to figure, but again, why can't we be the provider of that? We have all that information. And if we can automate it, we can take time off of these growers who are trying to do it manually, whether they're going to 16 different websites or looking at rainfall for 20 different fields. A dashboard, to me, visually show whatever they're interested in.
That would be very impressive, and I think, quite honestly, would be well received, Ben, from a lot of my growers, because I do think that they do feel like, to Tim's point, they eat up a lot of time going to those multiple sources, and being able to have that, I think, would be valuable. Maybe at some point within the future of the organization that can happen. We're probably not the three folks that are going to make that decision necessarily, but I do appreciate that, Tim. I do agree with you. I think growers would find real value in that.
I agree as well, Brian, and I think that this year probably stood out more than in most years, with just how variable and sporadic the rainfall was, particularly as we were coming out of the drought in June. Where you could, I don't recall how it was for you up there, but I'm going to say in central Indiana we had, you could have one field that was say an 80-acre field that looked great, and you could go across the road, you'd have 12 rows that looked great, and then 120 acres of corn were burning up. Just the rain was just so variable, and it popped up in little pockets and everything. So the other thing that comes to mind is farms aren't getting smaller, and you could keep track of your 20 fields pretty easily with your pen and paper and driving around and or having two or three rain gauges out, but that's not the case anymore, and it's going to be less of the case in the future. So yeah, I'll remain hopeful as well. Maybe it'll get here before I retire.
There we go. Fair enough. Well, Tim, thank you very much for joining the podcast today. We appreciate your time and your expertise as we've talked about Corteva, the weather pillar, and kind of the future of what that looks like for the organization and for our growers. And so do appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, like I said earlier, thanks for having me. And feel free to reach out with any questions if you have them.
All right, that'd be great. Ben, if somebody heard something on the podcast or wants to give you a little feedback on things, how can they get a hold of you?
Yep, you can find me on X, where I, get my weather information at the Ben Jacob, or occasionally on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. How about you, Brian?
Yep, you can find me on Instagram at B_K_Shrader. So with that, we'll call it an episode. Again, we appreciate Tim Hart, Senior Research Associate, for joining us today to talk about all things Corteva weather. If you've ever got any feedback for us on the podcast, please be sure to reach out, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.